At first, it was easy to dismiss as a mistake or a prank. After all, no one expects an email from a dead man. Yet, as I scanned the sender's name, chills prickled up my spine. The subject line read, "Urgent, meeting at sub-basement room B12. The message was brief and direct. "I trust you all remember your loyalty. Meet me in room B12 at midnight. Don't be late." It was signed by Edward Haynes, our company's founder, a man who had died nearly 5 years ago under murky circumstances. Some said he'd simply disappeared, leaving behind a legacy and a towering high-rise with offices he'd designed himself. Rumors swirled around his death, whispers of unfinished business and secrets buried in the building's foundations. I wasn't the only one who received the email. Soon, word spread around the office. Several of us gathered in the break room, comparing the strange message on our screens. The consensus was that someone in IT must be playing a joke, but no one wanted to admit how unnerved they were. Midnight came up faster than expected, and a few of us, myself included, decided to indulge our morbid curiosity and go. When the time came, only 4 of us dared to descend into the sub-basement. There was Richard, the skeptical IT guy who kept insisting we'd find an empty room and nothing more, Hannah, a junior analyst whose wide eyes revealed more excitement than fear, Sarah, who always claimed she didn't believe in ghosts, but clutched her necklace tightly as we headed down, and me, caught somewhere between curiosity and dread, feeling like we were walking into something we couldn't come back from. The instructions in the email guided us through the building in a way none of us had ever seen before. We took the service elevator, passing floors that hadn't been used in years, descending deeper than we thought the building even allowed. The air grew damp, heavy with an earthy, stale odor, and the walls narrowed, as if we were stepping into a part of the structure no one had seen in decades. After what felt like forever, the elevator stopped at the sub-basement level with a shutter, and we stepped into a hallway that looked as if it hadn't been touched since the building was constructed. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and patches of mold clung to the ceiling, casting a strange, organic pattern that moved in the flickering light. A single, unmarked door loomed at the end of the hallway, old and swollen with moisture. Etched faintly into the metal was B12. Richard scoffed, though his eyes betrayed him. "Probably just some old storage room," he muttered, pushing the door open with more bravado than conviction. We filed in, one by one, and what we found inside sent a cold chill through me. The room was a conference room, though not like any I'd seen before. The walls were lined with outdated, faded portraits of past employees, their faces stern and unblinking, almost accusatory. A long, narrow table filled the center, and at the head of the table, seated in shadow, was a figure that resembled Edward Haynes. The dim lights barely illuminated him, but I could make out his suit, pristine, as if it had been preserved, though his skin was ashen and thin, stretched over a skeletal frame. His face was shrouded in darkness, and his eyes glowed faintly, unnervingly alive. He lifted a hand, bony fingers curling as he beckoned us closer. "Welcome back, my loyal ones," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo that made my skin crawl. We froze, uncertain whether to laugh or scream. No one moved. The door slammed shut behind us, sealing us in. Hannah tried the handle, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. There was no sound from the hallway beyond. We were trapped. "I'm sure you're all curious why I called you here," the figure said, his voice dripping with a mockery of warmth. He leaned forward slightly, and the shadows parted just enough to reveal a flash of his face. His eyes were hollow, staring through us with an intensity that burned. "You're here because I need you, just as you once needed me." The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the room pulse with a life of its own. And that's when I noticed something horrifying. The portraits on the walls, the stern faces, they had started to change. Slowly, their expressions contorted, mouths twisting into sneers, eyes narrowing in malice. They seemed to follow us, watching our every move. Richard, always the skeptic, finally broke. Who are you?" he demanded, voice shaking despite his attempt to sound confident. "You're dead, this isn't real." The figure chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Death," he rasped, "is only a doorway, and I have found a way to keep it open." Sarah gasped, clutching at her necklace as if it could protect her. I could feel the air in the room thickening, as if something intangible and dark was pressing in from all sides. "I built this company with my blood, my soul," Haynes whispered, each word heavy and vile. "And my loyalty has not gone untested. But what about yours?" He extended his hand across the table, and in the flickering light, we could see his fingers were skeletal, skin taut and brittle over long, sharpened bones. One by one, he pointed at us, and with each motion, I felt an unbearable weight on my chest, as if he were peeling away parts of my mind, searching my memories, my fears. "You all took something from me," he continued. "My time, my trust, my life. His hand lingered on me, and I felt an iciness seep into my bones, a consuming, gnawing guilt that rose like bile in my throat. Now, you will give it back. The lights went out entirely, plunging us into total darkness. I could hear panicked breathing, and a stifled scream that might have been my own. And then came the sound of chairs scraping, as if someone, or something, was moving in the dark. Suddenly, hands gripped my shoulders, cold, brittle, and impossibly strong. I struggled, but the fingers only dug deeper, pinning me to my seat. A faint light flickered, revealing glimpses of the other three, Richard, Hannah, Sarah, all locked in place by the skeletal hands of the portraits, whose twisted faces now leered with cruel delight, as if relishing our helplessness. "Welcome back, my loyal ones," the figure said again, his voice layered with malice and glee. "Time to repay the debt." Then, one by one, the lights flickered off, each second darker, colder. I felt my strength fading, as if he was siphoning my very life force, feeding off our terror. And then, nothing. I don't know how much time passed before I awoke in my cubicle, my face pressed against my desk. The hum of the office sounded distant, hollow. I bolted upright, heart racing, glancing around. Everything looked normal. But as I looked down at my inbox, my blood ran cold. An email sat there, unread, from Edward Haynes. Subject: "Thank you for your loyalty." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single line: "Welcome back. Don't be late next time." The clock on my computer read midnight. It had been another endless night at the office. My desk was cluttered with coffee-stained papers, and my eyes burned from staring at the screen for hours. As the clock struck midnight, I finally closed my laptop, threw on my coat, and headed toward the elevator, ready to escape into the cold quiet of the city. When the elevator doors slid open, I was met with the familiar dull hum and stale scent of metal and carpet cleaner. I pressed the button for the lobby, hoping for a quick descent, but as the elevator began to move, I felt an odd lurch, like a heartbeat deep within the walls. It wasn't until I checked the floor numbers that I noticed something strange. After floor 9 came floor 8, then 7, but the floors weren't stopping. Past 6, past 5, it was as though the elevator had gone rogue, plunging into depths of the building that shouldn't even exist. Must be some kind of mechanical issue, I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at my stomach. I pressed the lobby button again, harder this time. But the elevator continued its descent. Then, as if mocking my attempts to rationalize, the lights flickered, bathing the elevator in a sickly yellow glow. The floor number indicator started flashing numbers I'd never seen before, negative numbers, descending further and further down. A moment later, the elevator slowed and dinged softly. The doors shuddered open, revealing a hallway that looked nothing like the sterile, modern decor of my building. It was dimly lit, lined with old-fashioned wooden walls and thick, faded carpet that stretched endlessly in either direction. Desks cluttered with ancient typewriters, telephones with rotary dials, and stacks of yellowed papers filled the space, as though frozen in time. The air smelled of dust and stale tobacco, mixed with something far less identifiable. Despite the urge to turn back, I found myself stepping out, pulled forward by an inexplicable curiosity. As I looked down the hallway, shadows shifted at the edge of my vision. My heartbeat quickened when I noticed the cubicles weren't empty. Figures sat in them, bodies hunched and unmoving, eyes fixed on something distant, as if caught mid-thought. Their clothing was decades out of date, old suits, vintage skirts, stiffly starched collars. The people looked wrong, somehow distorted, as though they were only half real. A woman near me turned, her face blank and doll-like, and her eyes met mine with a hollow, empty stare. Slowly, as if woken from a trance, she smiled, a slow, eerie smile that crept across her face in a way no human mouth should move. And then, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "We've been waiting." I staggered back, my heart pounding. Another figure down the hall turned to face me, and then another. Each one wore the same unsettling expression, each pair of eyes as hollow as the last. They began to murmur, a soft chant that filled the hall with a steady, rhythmic whisper, like the shuffling of dead leaves in the wind. "We've been waiting." Every instinct told me to turn and run, but when I spun around, the elevator was gone, replaced by another endless stretch of hallway. The murmuring grew louder, and the figures began to stand, unfolding from their chairs in stiff, unnatural motions. I took a step back, stumbling over something on the floor. My eyes darted down, and I nearly choked on a scream. A pile of ID badges lay scattered by my feet, each one marked with faded names and photos of people who looked disturbingly familiar. Some faces I recognized, employees who had vanished without a word over the years. One badge was lying face down, and when I flipped it over, my stomach lurched. It was my own face, staring back at me. Before I could react, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, squeezing with a strength that bordered on unnatural. I twisted around to see one of the figures standing inches away, his eyes cloudy, like he'd been staring into darkness for years. His mouth opened, revealing a void of darkness, and he spoke in a raspy, echoing whisper. "Welcome home, David." I jerked away, shaking his hand off, but he didn't release me easily. His nails dragged across my shoulder, leaving behind shallow scratches that burned as if I'd been touched by ice. Panicking, I backed away, only to collide with another figure behind me. The hallway was now filled with them, closing in from all sides, their faces twisted in expressions of longing, sorrow, and something darker, like hunger. Each one reached out, hands grasping at me, fingers curling like the claws of caged animals. I stumbled, falling to the floor, and crawled backward until my back hit something solid. I looked up, expecting another wall, but instead, I saw the elevator doors, standing open like a yawning mouth, waiting for me. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet and threw myself into it, mashing the "close door" button over and over, desperation blurring my vision. As the doors finally slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the hallway, a sea of hollow eyes and frozen smiles staring back at me. They watched in silence as the door sealed, locking me back into the tiny elevator. I sagged against the wall, breathing heavily, but relief was short-lived. The elevator didn't move. The air grew thick and oppressive, and the floor display blinked erratically, alternating between the lobby and that strange, negative floor number. Then, the elevator began to descend again. I screamed, pressing every button I could, clawing at the doors, but it was useless. The elevator kept descending, and each time it slowed, the doors would open to reveal another impossible floor, each one filled with more faces, more blank stares, more twisted, smiling mouths. Some floors showed old offices lined with desks, others were empty, filled only with shadows that seemed to move, watching me as I passed. After what felt like hours, the elevator slowed to a stop on a floor that was pitch black. The doors shuttered open, and for a moment, I sat frozen, too terrified to move. But then, something began to move in the dark. Faint shapes shifted, silhouetted against the faintest glimmer of light. Then I heard them again, their whisper filling the silence. "We've been waiting, David." My blood ran cold. I could feel them drawing closer, the smell of decay and dust filling the air as they crowded in, reaching out with skeletal fingers, their faces twisting into grotesque parodies of human expressions. I staggered back, pressing myself into the far corner of the elevator, closing my eyes as I felt their cold fingers graze my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the elevator lurched and began to ascend. I opened my eyes, and the figures were gone. The floors blinked by, faster and faster, until finally, with a loud ding, the elevator stopped at the lobby. The doors slid open, and I stumbled out, gasping, half expecting to find myself back in that dark, haunted hallway. But I was in the lobby, the familiar, sterile brightness almost blinding after what I'd just seen. I looked around, dazed, heart still racing, expecting. I didn't know what. A cleaning lady eyed me suspiciously, her cart squeaking as she pushed it toward the other end of the lobby. "Long night?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, too shaken to respond. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small, yellowed badge lying on the floor just outside the elevator. I bent to pick it up, and my stomach dropped when I saw the faded face staring back at me. It was me, on a company badge I'd never seen before, my expression hollow, my eyes distant, as if I had been somewhere else entirely. As I left the building that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left at all. The clock on my desk ticked with a rhythmic precision, each second metronomic in its reliability. But today, as the hands neared 5 p.m., something went wrong. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, a strange slowness that turned the clock's dependable click into something sluggish, sticky. I watched as the second hand dragged itself forward, fighting against some invisible resistance. At first, I thought I was just tired. It had been a long day. But as I stared, the dragging grew more apparent, like watching a film reel slow to a crawl. I looked around the office, expecting someone to notice the eerie malfunction, but my coworkers' cubicles were empty. I'd worked late enough for everyone else to go home. I was alone in the office, or so I thought. With a sigh, I turned back to my screen, willing the seconds to speed up, to click on. But when I looked back at the clock, only a single minute had passed. I had the uncanny sense that I'd been there longer, that minutes, maybe hours, had trickled by without me noticing. Shrugging it off as some kind of exhaustion, I continued typing, filling cells on the spreadsheet and sending off emails that had piled up through the day. A while later, I checked the time again, expecting it to be well past 5:30. It read 5:02. My hand froze on the mouse. A tightness started to spread in my chest. I glanced out the window of the high-rise, looking for signs of normalcy, a bustling city finishing its day. But the lights outside seemed dimmer, like the entire city had lost its vibrancy. I could barely make out the street below, where something even stranger was happening. The cars were still, locked mid-motion, headlights frozen, pedestrians mid-step. It was like I was staring at a photograph, the entire world outside suspended. I grabbed my phone. No bars, no Wi-Fi. I sent out a test email to myself, but it just sat in the outbox, going nowhere. My eyes darted around the office, scanning for any flicker of movement, any shadow of another person. But all I saw was the sterile expanse of empty cubicles. And then I heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of typing. Rapid, deliberate keystrokes, coming from somewhere across the room. The kind of sound that fills every office, but tonight, it felt wrong. The hair on my arms prickled as I rose, walking toward the sound. I peered around the corner into the next cubicle. Empty. The typing continued, each keystroke echoing in the dead silence of the office. I checked the cubicle across from it. Also empty. Yet, I could still hear it, growing louder, as if the source was moving toward me. I took a shaky step back, heart pounding, and the overhead lights flickered, plunging the room into an unsettling semi-darkness. In the faint glow of the emergency lights, my surroundings took on an otherworldly aura. Shadows stretched across the walls, elongated and strange. Then, as if on cue, the typing stopped. I swallowed hard, scanning the room for whatever had been making the sound, but there was nothing. Silence, thick and oppressive, settled over everything. I was alone. I started to turn back toward my desk when I felt it, an icy presence at my shoulder. I whipped around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. And then I saw it. A face, pale, with hollowed eyes and a ghostly smile, inches from mine, leaning out of the darkness. The figure's lips twisted into an unsettling grin, whispering with a voice that scraped like nails on glass. Time doesn't pass down here. I stumbled backward, heart racing, trying to put distance between myself and that horrible face, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only darkness and silence. I bolted for the elevator, mashing the button, but nothing happened. The doors remained stubbornly shut, the display above showing a frozen 5. I was trapped. The lights flickered again, and the typing resumed, this time louder and more frantic, like hundreds of fingers tapping against keys. It filled the entire room, an overwhelming cacophony that pounded against my skull. Covering my ears, I backed away, blindly stumbling down the corridor, desperate for some escape. I thought about the stairwell. Yes, that would do. I sprinted toward the emergency exit, heart hammering in my chest. My hand clamped around the door handle, and I threw it open, plunging into the dimly lit stairwell. Taking the stairs two at a time, I looked down, hoping to see the reassuring glow of the lobby lights below. Instead, the stairs spiraled endlessly downward, floor after floor stretching out of sight, each identical to the last. My mind reeled. No matter how many steps I took, I was still at floor 5. I should have reached the bottom by now, but the floors didn't change. The walls around me seemed to pulse, the paint peeling, exposing patches of dark, damp stone. I kept moving, my breath shallow and panicked, until I heard something behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing up the stairwell. I forced myself to turn. There, 3 steps below, stood the figure again, its head tilted unnaturally, eyes fixed on me with a look of twisted delight. "Did you think you could leave?" it asked, its voice low and taunting. I stumbled backward, turning to flee up the stairs this time, my feet pounding as I threw myself up step after step. But it didn't matter how fast I ran, it was always just behind me, that grin stretching wider, the steps closing in with agonizing slowness. Finally, I burst through the door back onto the office floor, panting and trembling. I didn't know what else to do. I ran to my desk, hoping, absurdly, that I could wake up from this nightmare if I just sat down, held on to something familiar. The clock on my desk still read 5:02. Sitting at my desk, I felt a crushing weight of despair. This place, whatever it was, held me in a grip that wouldn't let go. The clicking of the clock had slowed again, the second hand stuttering, almost mocking me as it inched forward. I looked up, and the lights had dimmed completely. In the darkness, the office filled with whispers, faint but persistent. They spoke of others who'd been trapped, of people who'd wandered into this strange limbo and never escaped. The whispers closed in around me, circling my mind with maddening, incoherent ramblings. And then, as if sensing my resignation, the face leaned close once more. This time, it stayed, hovering just inches away, that grin fixed, unwavering. "Time doesn't pass down here," it whispered, a hint of relish in its tone. "But we do." And with that, it faded, leaving me alone in the dim glow of the clock. I work in the kind of office that saps the life out of you: fluorescent lights, dusty gray cubicles, the smell of stale coffee wafting from a perpetually burning pot in the break room. We'd all been on edge after another round of layoffs. So, when a calendar event appeared without warning titled "Mandatory Training, Attendance Required," no one dared to question it. It was set for 10 p.m., an odd hour that made no sense. Usually, we'd all be home by then, escaping the building's gloomy fluorescent glow. But with the fear of job cuts still fresh, each of us knew we'd be in attendance. At 9:59 p.m., I stood outside the conference room with a handful of other employees: Max from IT, Susan from marketing, and Chris from HR, to name a few. We exchanged nervous glances, shrugging, chuckling, making weak jokes about late-night corporate bonding. None of us could figure out who had scheduled the event. HR claimed they hadn't, and IT denied any knowledge. But we were there, compelled by a mix of fear, compliance, and a strange curiosity. When I opened the door, the room was empty. The long, mahogany table stood in the center, surrounded by 12 identical chairs. There were no windows, only a dim, yellowed light from the overhead fixture flickered, casting shadows that made the room feel alive in its emptiness. The only sound was a faint crackling from the speakerphone at the center of the table and an odd, lingering smell: burnt coffee, strong and acrid. One by one, we sat down, exchanging confused looks. There was no paperwork, no projector, no trainer, nothing but that old speakerphone. I thought of suggesting we leave, but an inexplicable heaviness in the air seemed to settle over us, pressing down in a way that discouraged movement, even speech. "Hello?" Susan called out, her voice brittle in the stale air. Her question hung unanswered as the static on the speakerphone grew louder, a low crackle that scratched at the back of my skull. Then, a voice, flat and mechanical, spoke through the static. "Welcome to your mandatory training session. Please sit still and listen." The voice was devoid of any warmth, any humanity. It was neither male nor female, just an unsettling, monotone hum. I glanced around, expecting someone to laugh or roll their eyes, but instead, everyone sat motionless, eyes fixed on the speakerphone. It started reciting rules, policies none of us had heard before. The words were technical, bureaucratic nonsense, full of jargon that seemed to circle in on itself, becoming more abstract and senseless the longer we listened. "You will comply. You will remain still," the voice droned, its cadence hypnotic. Each syllable burrowed into my mind, lulling me, submerging my thoughts beneath a thick layer of fog. I tried to shift in my seat, but my limbs felt leaden, my body rooted to the chair as if by some invisible weight. Minutes stretched into hours, though it felt like no time at all. My head ached with a strange, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with the voice. Susan's eyes were glazed over, her mouth slack. Max stared blankly at the speakerphone, and Chris was leaning forward, his face inches from the table, unblinking. No one spoke, no one moved, and I felt my own resistance ebbing, swallowed by the relentless hum of that voice. Then, the tone of the voice changed. The words blurred, and a low humming filled the room. It was a deep, primal sound, vibrating in my bones, pressing down on me with a weight I could hardly bear. I felt it as a physical force, an invisible hand gripping my shoulders, pushing me closer to the table. My head drooped, my spine arched, and I saw the others sinking, folding in on themselves like marionettes under the weight of unseen strings. The humming grew louder, reverberating in my skull, drowning out any rational thought. I felt myself slipping away, consciousness fading to a pinpoint as something cold and dark seeped into my mind, filling me with a nameless dread. At some point, I must have closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the room was different. The lights had dimmed further, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the walls. The table, once smooth and polished, was now pitted and scarred, covered in strange, jagged etchings that hadn't been there before. The chairs were empty. My colleagues were gone, their chairs pulled neatly to the table, as if they'd never sat there at all. A shiver crawled up my spine. The clock on the wall showed 5:15 a.m. How had I lost so much time? And where was everyone else? I stumbled out of my chair, my legs weak, my head spinning. I made my way to the door, but it was locked. I banged on it, shouting, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the vast silence that filled the room. Just then, I heard it, the faint click of the speakerphone coming to life again. I turned, dread pooling in my stomach, as the static crackled back, the same mechanical voice filling the air. "This concludes your mandatory training. Thank you for attending." The voice was softer now, almost amused, with an edge of finality that made my skin crawl. The speakerphone went silent, and then, just as I thought I could finally breathe, the door clicked open. I staggered out, blinking in the harsh morning light that flooded the hallway. The building was silent, eerily empty. I ran to the nearest office, searching for anyone, security, a janitor, anyone who could tell me what had happened. Instead, I found my colleagues' desks empty. Their personal items, photos, coffee mugs, jackets, were gone. Every trace of them had vanished, as if they'd never existed. I searched each floor, each conference room, finding nothing but empty chairs and blank computer screens, untouched, abandoned. Shaken, I returned to my own desk, hoping for a sense of normalcy, but as I sat down, my computer screen flickered to life on its own, displaying a new calendar event. Mandatory training, attendance required, it read, set for tonight at 10 p.m. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, the words blurring before my eyes. I tried to delete the event, but the option was grayed out, unreachable. I tried again and again, feeling panic rise, but it remained there, solid, immovable. As the clock ticked down to 10 p.m., I felt a crushing certainty settle over me. There was no escape. It was a deadline night, one of those late evenings when the office felt more like a tomb than a workspace. Our team, myself, Aaron, Lila, and Mark, were burning the midnight oil on the top floor, pushing to finish the project that had been hanging over us for weeks. We were surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a sweeping view of the city, now swallowed by the pitch-black sky. Around 8:50 p.m., just as we were settling into the last stretch, a knock echoed from the hallway. Startled, we looked up to see Marta, one of the cleaning staff, standing at the door, her face pale and anxious. She pushed it open just a crack, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for something, or someone. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and tense. "It's almost 9 p.m. You need to leave. It's not safe." Lila chuckled, her fingers still flying over her keyboard. "Marta, we're fine. We'll just be a little while longer." But Marta didn't laugh, didn't even smile. Instead, she glanced at her watch, a hint of fear flashing in her eyes. "I'm serious. After 9, strange things happen up here. The last time someone stayed past," she stopped, swallowed hard, and shifted her gaze to me. "Just leave. Please." The urgency in her voice made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to smile. "We'll be okay, Marta. Really. We just have to wrap up a few things." Marta sighed, then muttered something under her breath. She looked over her shoulder down the empty hallway, then stepped back and left without another word. Her footsteps echoed, fading into silence. As the clock struck 9, I felt an uneasy stillness settle over the office. It wasn't the comforting quiet of an empty building, it was a dense, suffocating silence, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. I shook it off, dismissing Marta's warning as nothing more than an old woman's superstition. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping against the window. It was soft at first, almost like the distant peck of a bird. I looked up, squinting into the dark, but all I could see was my own reflection staring back at me. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Aaron, sitting closest to the windows, frowned and looked around. "Yeah, maybe a bird? Or something outside?" But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. One by one, we all turned to face the windows, peering out into the blackness beyond. And then, we saw them. Pale faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide and staring. Their features were blurry, indistinct, like they'd been smudged, smeared by a careless hand. But their expressions were unmistakable, faces twisted in fear, mouths open in silent pleas, hands raised to the glass as if begging to be let in. Lila gasped, recoiling from her desk. What are those?" None of us answered. We were all frozen, transfixed, as the faces began to multiply. One after another, they appeared, crowding against the glass, pressing closer and closer until it seemed like the windows themselves might shatter under the weight of them. Aaron moved toward the windows, as if in a trance, his hand outstretched. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't go near them. They look like they're trying to say something," he murmured, staring into the eyes of a woman whose face was twisted with desperation, her fingers splayed across the glass, fingertips almost white from the pressure. "No," I said, louder this time, trying to shake off the terror creeping up my spine. "Whatever they are, they're not asking for help. They're trying to get in." And then, as if responding to my words, the lights went out. The office was plunged into complete darkness, broken only by the faint city lights below. I fumbled for my phone, flicking on the flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the shadows. Somewhere to my right, I heard Lila whimper. "Turn it back on," Mark muttered, his voice trembling. "We need the lights back on." I stepped toward the wall, groping for the light switch, but the faces at the window caught my eye again, and my breath froze in my throat. They were gone. The windows were empty, only my flashlight reflecting back at me. Relief surged through me, though I didn't dare say anything, not yet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, when I heard a soft rustling behind me. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The faces were there, in the room with us, their spectral forms hovering inches from where we stood, blank eyes fixed on each of us, their mouths still twisted in silent pleas. They were closer now, so close I could see the texture of their skin, pale and translucent, the veins beneath their flesh like fine cracks in porcelain. Lila let out a scream, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence. I backed up, nearly stumbling into my desk, as the faces began to close in, surrounding us on all sides, their forms growing more solid, more real. "Get away!" Aaron yelled, though his voice wavered with terror. But they didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to shift, closing the gap between us with each heartbeat. My pulse thundered in my ears as I felt a chill, like icy fingers brushing my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt leaden, frozen by the presence of these silent, pleading faces. And then, one of them spoke. "Help us," it whispered, its voice a brittle, ghostly rasp that sent a chill down my spine. "Trapped, here." It stretched a hand toward me, fingers long and thin, curling in the air like tendrils of smoke. I stumbled back, but the hand moved closer, its coldness seeping into my skin, my veins, my very bones. "We stayed," it murmured, voice faint and hollow, "we stayed too long, and now, we're here. Forever." A second later, the lights flickered back on, flooding the room in harsh fluorescent light. Blinking, I looked around, and they were gone. The faces, the hands, all vanished as if they'd never been there. Lila was crouched by her desk, trembling, while Aaron clutched his head, muttering under his breath. Mark was staring at the windows, his face pale and drenched in sweat. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We grabbed our bags, practically bolted out of the office, and rode the elevator down in silence, none of us daring to look at each other. The next morning, I received an email notification, a new event on my calendar, set for 8:59 p.m., simply titled, "Final Notice, Attendance Required." The others got the same message, each of us staring at the screen in horror. And that night, just before 9 p.m., I sat at my desk, unable to move, paralyzed by the weight of a terrible understanding. They had warned us, after all. Forever had already begun.